A quiet welcome into the Victorian home. Good evening, and welcome. Thank you for being here, and for choosing to spend this quiet moment exploring history together. Tonight, we are not here to judge the past, and we are not here to shock ourselves awake with horror stories. Instead, we are simply opening a softly lit door into another time, a time when everyday life looked familiar on the surface, yet followed rules that would feel deeply strange today. This video is about Victorian parenting, and why many of the things considered normal, responsible, and even loving in the 19th century would be illegal by modern standards. Not because Victorian parents were cruel by nature, but because they lived inside a different understanding of childhood, discipline, health, and morality. In Victorian homes, parents believed they were doing what was right. They followed books, social expectations, religious advice, and medical opinions that all pointed in the same direction. Raise children to be obedient. Raise them to be disciplined. Raise them to survive in a hard world. What we call childhood today, with its emphasis on emotional safety, self-expression, and psychological development, did not yet exist in the same way. Children were expected to adapt quickly, to behave properly, and to prepare for adult life almost as soon as they could walk and speak. So as we move through this story, imagine yourself not as an outsider looking in with modern certainty, but as a quiet observer standing in the corner of a Victorian sitting room. The fire is low. The furniture is heavy. The rules are unspoken but firmly understood. Let us begin at the very foundation of it all, with the Victorian idea of what a child truly was. In Victorian Britain, childhood did not mean what it means today. There was no widely accepted idea that children needed emotional protection, personal expression, or gentle guidance. Instead, many adults believed that a child was simply an unfinished adult, a small and undisciplined version of what they were meant to become. From this perspective, childhood was not a sacred stage to be preserved. It was a problem to be solved. Victorian parents often saw their role as moral engineers. Their task was to shape character, suppress weakness, and prepare a child for a difficult and unforgiving world. Affection was considered risky. Too much kindness might soften the child, and softness was dangerous in a society where survival was never guaranteed. This belief did not come from cruelty alone. It was shaped by reality. Disease was common. Poverty was widespread. Many families had already buried children. Emotional distance was, in part, a form of self-protection. Loving less deeply made loss feel survivable. As a result, many children were raised with the expectation of obedience rather than understanding. Curiosity was not encouraged. Questions were often interpreted as challenges to authority. Silence, on the other hand, was praised. A quiet child was a good child. In Victorian homes, especially among the middle and upper classes, children were expected to be seen as little as possible. They spent long hours in nurseries or separate rooms, under the supervision of nannies or governesses. Parental interaction was formal and limited, often reserved for scheduled moments rather than spontaneous affection. Parents believed that emotional restraint taught discipline. Discipline, in turn, was believed to create virtue. Even play was carefully controlled. Free, noisy play was associated with disorder and moral decay. Structured activities, proper posture, and calm behavior were signs that a child was being raised correctly. A child who laughed too loudly or spoke too freely risked being corrected, not because the behavior was harmful, but because it suggested a lack of control. This mindset explains why so many practices that feel harsh today were once accepted without question. If a child was seen as morally incomplete, then strict guidance felt necessary. If childhood was only a temporary inconvenience on the way to adulthood, then comfort could wait. It is important to remember that Victorian parents did not think they were harming their children. On the contrary, many believed they were acting with responsibility and care. They were preparing their sons and daughters for a world that demanded endurance, restraint, and obedience. Modern psychology did not yet exist. Concepts like emotional development, attachment, and mental health were unknown. Behavior was interpreted through the lens of morality, not well-being. A child who misbehaved was not stressed, overwhelmed, or confused. They were simply undisciplined. And discipline, in Victorian thinking, was something to be applied early. This is where the quiet danger lies. When children are not recognized as emotionally distinct from adults, their needs become invisible. Fear becomes disobedience. Sadness becomes weakness. Silence becomes success. From today's perspective, this way of thinking feels cold. In many countries, it would now violate child welfare standards. But in the 19th century, it was the foundation of respectable parenting. Understanding this foundation helps everything else fall into place. The strict routines, the emotional distance, the physical punishment, and the heavy expectations all grew from this single idea. Children were not fragile beings to be protected. They were future adults to be controlled. As we move forward, we will see how this belief shaped daily life in Victorian homes, classrooms, and institutions. We will explore how discipline was enforced, how affection was withheld, and how many practices that once felt normal now feel impossible to imagine. For now, let this thought settle gently. In the Victorian world, love was often quiet, discipline was loud, and childhood was something to grow out of as quickly as possible. And that belief changed everything. If childhood in the Victorian mind was something to be corrected rather than protected, then discipline became the primary tool for shaping it. And discipline, in this era, was rarely gentle. To a Victorian parent, pain was not necessarily cruel. Pain was instructive. It was believed to leave a clear and lasting impression. One that words alone could not achieve. A sharp physical sensation, delivered at the right moment, was thought to carve morality directly into the body. Much like a lesson etched into stone. This belief made corporal punishment not only acceptable, but respectable. In homes across Britain, the tools of discipline were familiar objects. A wooden ruler, a cane, a strap, sometimes simply a hand. These were not hidden in shame. They were kept close, available when needed, and often used without hesitation. The act itself was framed as a duty rather than an emotional reaction. A parent who punished calmly was considered virtuous. Anger, oddly enough, was discouraged. Discipline was meant to be firm, controlled, and purposeful. Children were expected to understand this logic, even when they did not. Punishment could be delivered for a wide range of behaviors. Speaking out of turn, fidgeting, showing disrespect, questioning instructions. Even displays of strong emotion, such as crying too loudly or laughing at the wrong time, could be interpreted as signs of poor character. The body became the classroom, and pain became the lesson. Schools followed similar principles. Victorian classrooms were quiet spaces, filled with rigid posture and watchful eyes. Teachers were authority figures whose word was final. Punishments were often administered publicly, not to humiliate the child intentionally, but to instruct the rest. A single act of punishment was meant to ripple outward, reinforcing order through observation. From a modern perspective, this feels severe. But to Victorian society, it felt logical. Children were believed to lack self-control. Self-control, therefore, had to be imposed from the outside until it became internal. Pain was simply the fastest way to achieve that result. There was also a moral dimension. Punishment was thought to cleanse wrongdoing. Just as physical illness was treated with harsh remedies, moral failure required strong correction. A child who was punished and endured it quietly was seen as having learned something valuable. Endurance itself became a virtue. This approach created an unusual contradiction. While discipline was strict, emotional engagement was minimal. Parents were advised not to comfort a child immediately after punishment. Consolation might weaken the lesson. The child was expected to reflect, to internalize, and to emerge improved. Silence followed pain. And silence was success. It is here that the modern idea of legality begins to quietly emerge. Today, many of these practices would be considered abuse. Laws now recognize that physical punishment can cause lasting harm, both emotional and physical. But Victorian society did not have this framework. There were no child psychologists, no safeguarding systems, and very little public concern for emotional trauma. What mattered was outward behavior. If a child obeyed, sat still, and followed rules, the method was considered effective. Internal suffering was not measured, and often not acknowledged. Children were rarely asked how they felt about punishment. Their feelings were seen as unreliable, even irrelevant. Interestingly, this strictness was often paired with deep parental belief and duty. Many parents genuinely thought they were doing the right thing. They believed they were preparing their children for a harsh world, one that would not offer comfort or patience. In their minds, discipline at home was a kindness compared to what life itself would deliver. This belief also meant that punishment was applied unevenly. Children of lower social classes often faced harsher discipline, both at home and in institutions. For wealthier families, punishment might be more controlled, more ceremonial. But it was still present. Class shaped the form, not the philosophy. There were critics, even then. Some educators and reformers questioned whether fear truly produced virtue. But these voices were quieter than tradition. For many families, discipline was inherited, passed down through generations without much reflection. It is worth noting that children were not entirely passive in this system. Some learned to hide emotions skillfully. Others learned to comply outwardly while resisting inwardly. A few broke under the pressure. These outcomes were rarely discussed openly. Victorian society valued appearances, and well-behaved children were proof enough that the system worked. In this way, discipline became self-reinforcing. Obedient children validated the method. Disobedient children justified harsher punishment. The cycle continued, rarely questioned. As you imagine these scenes, try not to picture constant chaos or cruelty. Much of this discipline was quiet, routine, and ordinary. It happened between meals, after lessons, in moments that barely registered as remarkable at the time. That ordinariness is what makes it unsettling now. What once blended seamlessly into daily life now stands out sharply against modern values. And yet, this system did not exist in isolation. It was supported by beliefs about silence, emotional restraint, and the dangers of affection. To understand discipline fully, we must also understand what was deliberately withheld. In the next part of our journey, we will step away from pain itself and look instead at absence. At the quiet spaces where warmth, comfort, and emotional closeness were intentionally limited, and why that absence was once considered a strength. For now, let this thought rest gently. In the Victorian world, pain was not the opposite of care. It was, strangely enough, one of its most trusted forms. If pain was one tool of Victorian parenting, silence was another, quieter one. It left no marks on the skin, but it shaped the inner world of children just as deeply. In many Victorian households, emotional distance was not seen as neglect. It was seen as wisdom. Parents were often advised, both by social custom and by popular parenting manuals, to restrain affection. Too much closeness, it was believed, would weaken a child's character. Warmth might encourage dependency. Comfort might invite indulgence. Love, if shown too openly, risked spoiling the child long before adulthood arrived. This created a household atmosphere that modern ears might find unsettlingly calm. Children were expected to be composed, self-contained, and emotionally reserved. Loud joy, visible frustration, or spontaneous affection were all gently, and sometimes firmly, discouraged. A child who learned to sit quietly, speak politely, and suppress strong feelings was praised as mature beyond their years. In this context, silence was not emptiness. Silence was achievement. Many Victorian parents genuinely believed that emotional restraint prepared children for real life. The world outside the home was harsh, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. Workplaces did not pause for feelings. Society did not reward vulnerability. Teaching children to regulate themselves early was seen as an act of care. This belief was reinforced by class expectations. In middle and upper-class families especially, emotional control was a marker of respectability. A well-raised child was one who did not draw attention, did not interrupt adults, and did not demand comfort. Children were taught to observe, not participate. Physical separation supported this emotional distance. Children often slept in separate rooms and spent much of their time with caregivers rather than parents. Meals were sometimes taken apart from adults. Family life was structured, formal, and guided by routines rather than spontaneous connection. Affection was not entirely absent. It was simply controlled. Love was expressed through provision, instruction, and moral guidance rather than touch or verbal reassurance. A parent might believe deeply in their duty to a child while rarely saying a kind word aloud. This style of parenting shaped how children learned to understand themselves. Without language for feelings, emotions became private burdens. Sadness was endured quietly. Fear was hidden. Joy was softened to avoid appearing unruly. From today's perspective, this emotional restraint looks damaging. Modern psychology emphasizes attachment, reassurance, and emotional expression as essential to healthy development. But Victorian society did not have this framework. Emotional suffering was often invisible, especially when behavior appeared orderly. A calm child was assumed to be a content child. There was also a moral element to this distance. Strong emotions were often associated with moral weakness. Anger suggested lack of self-control. Desire suggested temptation. Even excessive happiness could appear undignified. Emotional neutrality became a form of virtue. This belief extended into education. Teachers expected quiet classrooms, not only for order, but for character formation. Students learned early that speaking without permission, laughing freely, or expressing frustration could be seen as moral failings rather than natural reactions. Over time, many children adapted. They learned to read rooms carefully, to measure their words, and to keep their inner lives private. Some carried this reserve into adulthood, becoming composed and disciplined by Victorian standards. Others struggled silently, their distress unnoticed and unaddressed. It is important to recognize that emotional distance was not always intentional cruelty. Often, it was inherited behavior. Parents raised without affection repeated what they knew. Emotional reserve passed quietly from one generation to the next, rarely questioned. Today, this style of parenting would raise serious concerns. Emotional neglect is now recognized as harmful, even in the absence of physical violence. Laws and social services acknowledge that children require emotional safety, not just physical survival. In Victorian times, survival itself was the priority. Understanding this helps explain why emotional warmth was often treated as optional, even risky. When life expectancy was uncertain and resources were limited, preparing children to endure mattered more than teaching them to feel. As this session settles, imagine a quiet Victorian nursery. Toys neatly arranged. A child sitting upright. Hands folded, waiting. Not crying. Not laughing. Simply waiting. By the standards of the time, this was success. But silence can carry many meanings. And as we move forward, we will see how this emotional restraint combined with responsibility placed on children far earlier than we would consider acceptable today. In the next part, we will step into the working lives of children, where responsibility was not symbolic, but real, and where childhood often ended not with reflection, but with labor. If silence taught children how to behave, work taught them why behavior mattered. In Victorian society, labor was not simply a means of survival. It was a moral lesson. One that many believed could only be learned through experience, and preferably at a young age. For a large number of Victorian children, childhood did not gradually fade into adulthood. It ended abruptly, often as soon as their bodies were considered useful. In working-class families, children contributed economically from an early age. Some began helping at home almost as soon as they could walk, running errands, caring for younger siblings, or assisting in family trades. Others entered factories, workshops, farms, or domestic service while still very young. This was not always seen as exploitation. It was framed as responsibility. Work was believed to build character. Victorian society placed enormous value on industriousness. Idleness was associated with moral failure, laziness, and even criminality. A working child was viewed as protected from temptation, guided by routine, and anchored in purpose. Long hours and physical fatigue were not signs of harm, but proof of diligence. From this perspective, labor was a form of education. It taught obedience, endurance, and respect for authority. These qualities were considered far more important than play, curiosity, or emotional expression. Time spent working was time spent becoming a proper adult. The nature of this work varied widely depending on class. Middle-class children were less likely to enter factories. But they were not free from labor. Their work took different forms. Structured lessons, strict schedules, and constant preparation for future roles replaced physical toil. Academic pressure and moral instruction filled their days, leaving little space for unstructured play. Upper-class children, too, were trained rather than indulged. While shielded from physical hardship, they were raised under heavy expectations. Tutors, etiquette lessons, and rigid social codes shaped their behavior. Their labor was symbolic, but no less demanding. They were working toward a role, a reputation, and a future position in society. In all cases, the message was the same. Childhood was not a time to rest. It was a time to prepare. Modern listeners may wonder how society justified exposing children to dangerous or exhausting conditions. The answer lies partly in necessity. Families needed income. Children were a source of labor in an economy that offered little protection. But necessity alone does not explain acceptance. Cultural belief played an equally powerful role. Work was seen as morally cleansing. It kept children occupied and out of trouble. A tired child, the thinking went, was less likely to misbehave. Fatigue was preferable to imagination. Routine was safer than freedom. This belief extended into institutions. Workhouses and reform schools used labor as both punishment and reform. Children who were poor, orphaned, or considered unruly were often placed in environments where work dominated daily life. These institutions claimed to rescue children from vice by immersing them in discipline and productivity. From today's legal standpoint, many of these practices would be unacceptable. Child labor laws now exist to protect education, health, and development. But in Victorian times, such protections were rare or non-existent. Childhood labor was woven into the fabric of society. It is important to note that not all children experienced this as constant suffering. Some found pride in contributing. Others formed friendships through shared work. But choice was limited. The option not to work rarely existed. The emotional cost of this system often went unnoticed. Fatigue was normalized. Stress was invisible. When children struggled, it was interpreted as weakness rather than overload. The idea that a child might need rest for emotional reasons simply did not register. As industrialization advanced, criticism slowly emerged. Reformers began to question whether constant labor truly built character or simply wore children down. These voices would eventually lead to legal change, but progress was slow and uneven. For most of the Victorian era, early labor remained a sign of virtue. A child who worked was a child who belonged. A child who did not was suspicious. As you picture this world, imagine small hands performing repetitive tasks, day after day. Not in rebellion, but in quiet acceptance. This was not considered tragic. It was considered training. And yet, beneath the rhythm of work, something else was missing. Time. Space. care for the body and mind in moments of vulnerability. To understand how deeply Victorian society misunderstood children's needs, we must also look at how it attempted to care for their health. In the next part, we will turn to medicine. Not modern medicine, but Victorian remedies for children, where good intentions met limited knowledge, and comfort often came in unexpected forms. After long days of discipline and labor, Victorian society still faced a question that every generation must answer in its own way. What should be done when a child is sick, restless, frightened, or simply unable to sleep? The Victorian answer was medicine. But not medicine as we understand it today. In the 19th century, medical knowledge was limited, uneven, and often guided by tradition rather than evidence. Germ theory was still developing. Childhood development was poorly understood. Many doctors relied on observation, habit, and substances that seemed to work in the moment, even if their long-term effects were unknown. For children, this meant that comfort often came in the form of sedation. One of the most common ingredients in Victorian children's remedies was opium, usually mixed into syrups, drops, or soothing tonics. These preparations were not considered dangerous. They were sold openly, recommended by doctors, and trusted by parents. Opium quieted crying, reduced pain, and encouraged sleep. For exhausted families living in crowded conditions, this felt like relief. A quiet child was a healthy child, or so it seemed. Infants were sometimes given small doses to ease teething pain or calm persistent crying. Older children received similar mixtures for coughs, fevers, or general irritability. These medicines did not cure illness, but they softened its outward signs. Restlessness faded. Complaints stopped. The household returned to calm. From a modern perspective, this is alarming. But Victorian parents did not have access to safer alternatives. They were working within the limits of what they believed medicine could do. Many genuinely thought they were acting in their child's best interest. Alcohol also played a role. Small amounts of spirits were sometimes used to stimulate appetite, warm the body, or help children sleep. Wine or diluted liquor appeared in home remedies, especially during cold weather. The warming sensation was interpreted as healing, and the resulting drowsiness was welcomed. These practices reflected a broader misunderstanding of children's bodies. Children were often treated as smaller adults, expected to respond to medicine in similar ways. The idea that their developing systems might be more vulnerable was not widely recognized. Doctors of the time focused on symptoms rather than causes. If a child cried, the goal was to stop the crying. If sleep was disturbed, the goal was to restore silence. Comfort was measured by outward behavior, not internal well-being. There was also a moral layer to medical treatment. Restlessness, sleeplessness, or excessive emotion were sometimes interpreted as signs of poor discipline rather than illness. Medicine was used not only to heal, but to reinforce order. A sedated child was easier to manage, easier to teach, and easier to control. This blending of care and control was rarely questioned. In wealthier households, medicine was administered with ritual and respect. Bottles were labeled, doses carefully measured, and schedules followed. In poorer homes, remedies were shared, reused, and sometimes guessed at. In both cases, children had little say in what entered their bodies. Tragic consequences did occur. Accidental overdoses were not uncommon, especially among infants. But these events were often framed as misfortune rather than systemic failure. The idea that the medicine itself might be inappropriate took time to emerge. As the century progressed, some reformers began to question these practices. Medical professionals slowly recognized that children responded differently to drugs, that sedation masked problems rather than solved them. But change was gradual. Habits rooted in tradition are difficult to undo. From a legal standpoint today, many of these treatments would be unacceptable. Giving sedative substances to children without strict regulation would raise serious concerns. Yet in the Victorian era, regulation was minimal, and trust in authority was high. Parents trusted doctors. Doctors trusted tradition. Children were expected to endure. It is also important to remember the emotional context. Many families lived with constant stress. Noise, illness, and exhaustion were part of daily life. Medicine that promised peace, even briefly, felt like a gift. In that sense, Victorian medicine for children was not only about health. It was about managing anxiety, restoring order, and creating moments of quiet in a world that rarely offered rest. As you imagine a Victorian night, picture a dimly lit room, a small bottle on a bedside table, and a parent hoping for silence more than answers. The intention was not harm. It was relief. And yet, beneath that relief lay misunderstanding. Children's bodies were not simply small machines to be adjusted. They were developing systems, sensitive and complex. That truth would take generations to fully understand. As this session settles, consider how medicine reflects a society's values. In Victorian times, calmness was prized. Silence was reassuring. Medicine served those priorities. In the next part, we will leave the medicine cabinet behind and turn to daily routines. To sleep, to feeding, and to the strict schedules that governed even the earliest moments of a child's life. By the time a Victorian child reached the end of the day, their world had already been shaped by silence, labor, and medicine. But even rest itself was not left to instinct or comfort. Sleep and feeding, the most basic rhythms of life, were carefully regulated, structured, and disciplined from the very beginning. In Victorian parenting, routine was everything. Parents were encouraged to establish strict schedules for infants almost immediately. Feeding times were fixed. Sleeping hours were decided in advance. Crying outside of these routines was not treated as communication, but as something to be corrected. A child, it was believed, must learn order early, before disorder became habit. This belief led to one of the most striking differences between Victorian and modern parenting. Babies were often expected to sleep alone, in separate rooms, much earlier than would be common today. Nighttime crying was frequently ignored, not out of neglect, but out of principle. Responding too quickly, parents were warned, would teach dependence. The idea was simple. A child who learned to self-soothe would grow into an independent adult. Comfort, when offered too freely, was thought to weaken resilience. So parents waited. They listened. And often, they did nothing. From a modern viewpoint, this sounds harsh. But in Victorian thinking, it was an act of discipline, not indifference. Sleep was training. Nighttime was a lesson. Feeding followed similar rules. Infants were fed on schedules rather than on demand. Hunger outside designated times was considered a failure of routine, not a signal of need. Mothers were advised to resist responding emotionally and instead trust the clock. This approach reflected a deep faith in structure. Victorian society believed that order created virtue. Predictable routines were thought to shape both body and character. A child who learned to eat and sleep according to schedule was believed to be learning self-control at the most fundamental level. Of course, not all families followed these ideals perfectly. Reality often interfered. Working-class parents juggling labor and survival adapted as they could. But the ideal remained powerful, especially in advice literature and middle-class households. Parenting manuals of the era emphasized consistency above all else. They warned against overindulgence, a term that could mean something as simple as comforting a crying child too quickly. Indulgence, it was said, led to weakness. Weakness led to moral failure. There was also a practical side to these routines. In crowded homes, especially in cities, quiet nights mattered. Parents were exhausted. Families lived close together. A child who cried through the night affected everyone. Teaching children to sleep quietly was not only philosophical, it was necessary. Feeding schedules also reflected social values. Meals were orderly events, even for young children. Eating was not playful or exploratory. It was a task, performed properly, with correct posture and behavior. Messiness was discouraged. Appetite was regulated. Through these daily rituals, children learned that their bodies were subject to external control. Hunger, fatigue, and discomfort were not emergencies. They were inconveniences to be managed. This approach created children who were often outwardly calm. They slept when expected. They ate when told. From the outside, the system appeared to work. But internally, many children adapted by suppressing signals. Crying less did not necessarily mean feeling less. It meant learning that expression was ineffective. Victorian society largely interpreted this quiet compliance as success. A baby who stopped crying was seen as settled. A child who followed routines without protest was seen as well-raised. Emotional needs were invisible if behavior was orderly. Today, sleep and feeding are understood differently. Modern research emphasizes responsiveness, emotional security, and flexibility. Ignoring distress is now recognized as potentially harmful. Strict schedules have given way to gentler guidance. Legally and socially, many Victorian practices would now raise serious concerns. Prolonged ignoring of a child's needs could be considered neglect. Rigid feeding practices might be flagged as harmful. But in the 19th century, these routines were signs of care. They were meant to prepare children for a world that valued endurance over comfort. As you imagine these scenes, picture a quiet house at night. A baby crying softly in the dark. A parent awake, listening, reminding themselves that this is necessary. That this is teaching strength. That tomorrow will be easier. These moments were not dramatic. They were ordinary. Repeated night after night, they shaped the earliest experiences of trust, comfort, and selfhood. And yet, Victorian parents did not see this as shaping inner life. They saw it as building order. As this session comes to rest, consider how deeply daily routines influence who we become. In Victorian homes, even sleep was a lesson, and even hunger was an opportunity for discipline. In the next part, we will turn our attention to the physical body itself, to clothing, hygiene, and health, and to the ways Victorian society tried to protect children while quietly restricting them. By the time Victorian children learned when to sleep, when to eat, and when to stay silent, their bodies themselves had become carefully managed objects. Health, hygiene, and clothing were treated not simply as matters of comfort, but as moral and social concerns, shaped by fear, tradition, and limited scientific understanding. Victorian society cared deeply about children's health. But what health meant, and how it was protected, looked very different from today. Cleanliness, for example, was not always associated with frequent bathing. Many Victorians believed that water, especially cold water, could weaken the body or invite illness. Sudden exposure to cold air after bathing was thought to be dangerous, particularly for children, whose bodies were believed to be fragile and easily shocked. As a result, children were often bathed infrequently. Instead, cleanliness was maintained through changing clothes, brushing hair, and washing hands and faces. A child who appeared tidy was considered clean enough. What mattered was not invisible germs, which were not yet fully understood, but visible order. Fresh air, too, was treated with caution. Drafts were feared. Open windows were suspected of carrying harmful vapors. Many parents believed that illness traveled through bad air rather than through contact or microbes. Children were bundled carefully, protected from imagined threats drifting through the room. This fear of exposure extended directly into clothing. Victorian children were often dressed in multiple layers. Regardless of season, clothing was designed to shape the body as much as to cover it. Stiff fabrics, tight collars, and restrictive garments were common, even for young children. These clothes were meant to encourage good posture, discipline, and modesty. Comfort was secondary. In particular, children were taught to sit and stand correctly, supported by their clothing. Slouching was discouraged, not only because it looked improper, but because it was believed to reflect poor character. A straight spine suggested moral strength. Clothing helped enforce that ideal. For girls, restriction began especially early. Tight bodices and carefully structured garments limited movement, training the body to conform to social expectations. For boys, formal clothing emphasized restraint and control. Running freely, climbing, or sprawling was discouraged, not only because it damaged clothes, but because it encouraged wildness. Even play was shaped by these ideas. Children were allowed to play, but within boundaries. Rough play risked injury, disorder, and torn clothing. Controlled games were preferred. The body was to be managed, not explored. From a modern perspective, many of these practices appear harmful. Restrictive clothing can interfere with physical development. Limited movement affects strength and coordination. Infrequent bathing carries obvious risks. But Victorian parents were not intentionally harming their children. They were protecting them from what they believed were real dangers. Without a clear understanding of bacteria and infection, prevention focused on appearance and avoidance. If a child looked healthy, stood straight, and stayed warm, that was considered success. Medical advice of the time reinforced these beliefs. Doctors often warned against overexertion, excessive bathing, and exposure to cold. Parents followed this guidance carefully, believing they were safeguarding their children's future. There was also a moral dimension to hygiene and dress. Cleanliness was linked to respectability. A well-dressed child reflected well on the family. Clothing signaled discipline, order, and social standing. Parents were not only raising children, they were presenting them to society. This pressure was especially strong in urban environments, where class distinctions were visible and judgment was constant. A child's appearance could affect opportunities, treatment, and reputation. Dressing properly was a form of protection against social failure. Today, many of these practices would raise concern. Overly restrictive clothing, limited physical freedom, and poor hygiene standards could be seen as neglectful or harmful. Modern health guidelines emphasize movement, comfort, and cleanliness based on scientific understanding. But Victorian parents were navigating uncertainty. They acted with the knowledge they had, guided by fear of illness, desire for respectability, and trust in authority. As you imagine these children, picture carefully buttoned coats, stiff shoes, and layers of fabric. Picture a child learning not only how to behave, but how to hold their body in the world. Upright, controlled, contained. The body, like the mind, was trained to conform. These daily restrictions shaped how children experienced their physical selves. Movement became cautious. Sensation became muted. The body was something to manage, not something to enjoy. And yet, even as Victorian society focused on physical control, it was deeply concerned about something less visible. Morality, desire, inner thoughts that could not be easily seen or corrected. In the next part, we will explore how fear of moral failure shaped the supervision of children's behavior, thoughts, and curiosity, and how shame became another quiet tool of control. As Victorian children learned to control their bodies, their schedules, and their emotions, there was one more area that required careful management. It was less visible, harder to measure, and far more unsettling to Victorian adults. This was the inner moral life of the child. Victorian society lived with a quiet fear. It feared disorder, temptation, and moral decay, and nowhere were these fears more concentrated than in children. Children were believed to be naturally impulsive, easily led astray, and morally unfinished. Left unchecked, their thoughts and curiosities might wander into dangerous territory. As a result, supervision became a constant presence in daily life. Not always loud or forceful, but persistent and watchful. In many homes, children were rarely truly alone. Time was structured. Movement was observed. Activities were chosen carefully. Reading material, Conversations, even friendships were monitored to ensure they aligned with proper values. The goal was not simply obedience, but moral purity. This supervision extended beyond behavior into thought itself. Children were taught to examine their own actions, to recognize wrongdoing, and to feel remorse. Guilt was considered an important teacher. Shame, when applied carefully, was believed to guide children back toward virtue. Mistakes were rarely treated as learning opportunities. Instead, they were framed as moral failures. A child who lied, spoke improperly, or displayed curiosity about forbidden subjects was not simply corrected. They were warned. Their conscience was addressed. They were reminded of consequences. This approach created an internal observer. Over time, many children learned to watch themselves, to anticipate disapproval before it arrived. External supervision slowly became internal control. From the Victorian perspective, this was success. The moral dangers parents feared were often vague but deeply felt. Curiosity itself could be risky. Questions about the body, relationships, or personal feelings were often discouraged or punished. Silence was safer than explanation. Avoidance was preferable to discussion. Children were expected to be innocent, but not ignorant. They were to follow rules without fully understanding them. This created a strange tension. Curiosity was natural, but acknowledging it was dangerous. Shame filled the gap left by explanation. In schools and religious settings, this moral training intensified. Sermons, lessons, and moral stories emphasized obedience, self-denial, and purity. Children learned early that being watched was normal. Authority figures represented not only social order, but moral judgment. Even play was shaped by this awareness. Games that encouraged imagination or role play were sometimes viewed with suspicion. Too much fantasy could blur moral boundaries. Proper play was orderly, structured, and supervised. From a modern viewpoint, this constant moral surveillance feels heavy. Today, children are encouraged to ask questions, explore identity, and understand boundaries through discussion. Shame is recognized as potentially damaging when used as a primary teaching tool. In Victorian times, however, shame was considered efficient. It was quiet. It required no physical punishment. It lingered. A child who felt ashamed was thought to be less likely to repeat wrongdoing. This system was reinforced by religion, social expectations, and community pressure. Families were judged by their children's behavior. A misbehaving child reflected poorly on parents. Maintaining moral order was not just personal, but public. The emotional cost of this environment was rarely discussed. Anxiety, confusion, and fear were interpreted as signs of conscience rather than distress. A child who worried excessively was often praised for being thoughtful. Over time, many children learned to separate their inner thoughts from their outer behavior. They complied outwardly while keeping their questions private. Others internalized fear deeply, shaping how they related to authority for the rest of their lives. Once again, these practices were not driven by cruelty alone. They were rooted in fear of a fragile moral order. Victorian society believed that civilization itself depended on self-restraint, and children were the foundation of that restraint. From a legal standpoint today, constant psychological pressure, moral intimidation, and shaming would raise serious concerns. Emotional well-being is now recognized as essential. But in the 19th century, moral strength was valued above emotional comfort. As you picture this world, imagine a child sitting quietly, aware of being watched even when alone. Thoughts carefully managed. Curiosity softened. Questions unasked. This was not chaos. It was order. And yet, beneath that order lay differences that Victorian society often overlooked. Not all children were watched in the same way. Not all families had the same expectations or protections. In the next part, we will explore how class shaped childhood, and why Victorian parenting looked very different depending on where a child was born. By now, it may feel as though Victorian childhood followed a single, rigid pattern. Strict discipline. Emotional distance. Early responsibility. Moral supervision. But this picture, while broadly true, hides an important reality. Victorian parenting was not experienced equally by all children. Class shaped childhood in quiet but powerful ways. In Victorian society, where a child was born mattered enormously. For working-class children, childhood was often short and practical. Survival came first. Parents were not guided by parenting manuals or philosophical ideals so much as by necessity. Food had to be earned. Rent had to be paid. Children became contributors as soon as they were able, and this expectation was rarely questioned. Discipline in these households was often direct and immediate. There was little time for reflection or moral instruction. Obedience mattered because it kept households functioning. Emotional distance, when it existed, was not always ideological. It was often the result of exhaustion. Yet even here, care existed. Parents worried. They protected where they could. But options were limited. Choices that seem cruel today were often made under pressure, not principle. Middle-class childhood looked different on the surface, but carried its own burdens. These families were the primary audience for Victorian parenting advice. Manuals, lectures, and articles promised to produce disciplined, respectable children through careful routines and moral guidance. Middle-class parents were deeply concerned with reputation. A child's behavior reflected directly on the family's social standing. As a result, emotional restraint was often strongest here. Children were carefully managed. Not only for their own sake, but to maintain appearances. Manners mattered. Silence mattered. Self-control mattered. Middle-class children were less likely to work physically. But they were rarely idle. Their days were filled with lessons, supervised play, and constant evaluation. Success was measured not in income, but in propriety. Upper-class children occupied yet another world. Shielded from economic hardship, they were raised with the expectation of leadership and responsibility. Tutors replaced schools. Nannies replaced parents in daily care. Emotional distance was institutional rather than personal. Children were surrounded by adults, yet often deeply alone. For these children, discipline was subtle but persistent. Expectations were high. Failure carried social consequences. A child who did not meet standards risked future embarrassment rather than immediate punishment. Across all classes, one truth remained consistent. Childhood was shaped by adult priorities, not children's needs. The legal system reflected these inequalities. Laws protecting children, where they existed, were applied unevenly. Child labor regulations were slow to emerge and poorly enforced. Middle-class reformers often focused on the visible suffering of poor children, while overlooking emotional harm within their own homes. Institutions filled the gaps left by families. Orphanages, workhouses, and reform schools took in children who fell outside traditional family structures. These environments were often harsh, emphasizing discipline and labor over care. For children without family protection, Victorian parenting ideals became rigid systems with little room for compassion. From today's perspective, this unevenness raises serious concerns. Modern child welfare laws aim to protect all children equally, regardless of class. But in Victorian times, inequality was accepted as natural. Childhood, like adulthood, was shaped by social position. This class divide also influenced how parenting practices were judged. A working-class parent might be criticized for neglect, while a middle-class parent was praised for strictness. The same behavior could be condemned or celebrated depending on who practiced it. Understanding this helps explain why Victorian parenting persisted for so long. It was not a single system, but a collection of overlapping practices, each reinforced by social expectations. As you imagine these different childhoods, picture parallel worlds. A child in a factory rising before dawn. A child in a drawing room practicing posture. A child in a grand house learning restraint from strangers. Different surroundings. Similar lessons. Obedience. Endurance. Silence. Today, these differences feel unjust. Childhood is now seen as a universal stage deserving protection. Laws attempt to remove class from the equation. But this shift took time, and it required society to reconsider deeply held beliefs. As this session settles, notice how easily we speak of Victorian parenting as a single idea. In truth, it was many ideas, shaped by class, economics, and fear of disorder. In our final session, we will step back from individual practices and ask a broader question. Why was all of this accepted? And how did society slowly begin to change its mind? As we come to the end of this journey through Victorian childhood, one gentle question lingers. How were these parenting practices accepted for so long, even when they seem so harsh by modern standards? The answer lies not in cruelty, but in context. Victorian life was uncertain and often fragile. Illness spread easily. Medical knowledge was limited. Many children did not survive into adulthood. In such conditions, parents focused less on emotional comfort and more on preparation for hardship. Strength, obedience, and self-control were seen as forms of protection. Discipline was believed to build character. Silence was associated with respect. Endurance was praised as a virtue. A child who followed rules, worked hard, and caused little trouble was considered successful, even if that success came at an emotional cost that few recognized at the time. Science had not yet given language to emotional well-being. Stress, anxiety, and fear were not clearly understood, especially in children. If a child appeared healthy and behaved properly, deeper distress often went unnoticed. Pain without visible signs was easy to overlook. Change did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly. As industrial society evolved, education expanded and medical understanding improved. Thinkers and reformers began to question whether strict discipline truly created strong adults, or whether it simply taught children to hide their feelings. New ideas about development, care, and emotional safety began to take shape. Gradually, laws followed. Child labor was restricted. Schooling became compulsory. Harsh punishment was questioned. Childhood itself began to be seen as a unique stage of life, worthy of patience and protection. From today's perspective, many Victorian parenting practices would be illegal. Not because modern parents are inherently kinder, but because society now understands children differently. What once seemed necessary now appears harmful simply because knowledge has grown. Looking back, it is important to remember that Victorian parents acted within the limits of their time. They loved their children, worried about their futures, and did what they believed was right. History reminds us that care changes as understanding deepens. And now, as this story gently closes, allow your thoughts to slow. Imagine the past settling into silence, its lessons preserved but its weight lifted. You do not need to carry these histories with you tonight. Let them rest where they belong. The day is over. The mind can soften, and sleep can arrive, quietly and without effort.